at the African Development Bank Group, we have certainly welcomed the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative, its extension, and the Common Framework for Debt Restructuring. They have respectively really helped to temporarily mitigate debt challenges across really a large number of African countries. However, as Professor Gilpin mentioned, middle-income countries have not been able to benefit from this initiative. And linked to another problem has, of course, been that we must bear in mind that the composition of debt has changed, which was also presented in a number of the opening remarks. And with many different types of investors, a lot of this debt is also hidden or wrapped up in complex loans, such as resource-backed loans, making the coordination of any debt restructuring, whether under the DSSI or other, or resolution, really hugely complex. And we are really seeing examples of protracted debt restructuring across the continent, Zambia, Mozambique, Chad, and so on. And the problem is really that the existing architecture for debt restructuring really relies heavily on good faith negotiations between debtors and creditors. And without coordination among creditors, there is the risk of holdouts, free riding of investors, which really can undermine any resolution process. So really what I'm saying is the absence of the private sector creditors at the table really does remain an issue. And linked to this, countries have also been reluctant to ask from debt relief from official creditors out of fear of suffering the downgrades by rating agencies, which can then in turn limit access to international capital markets in the future when they're most needed. So better coordination remains a requirement, as well as working with rating agencies or agreeing on a common framework with rating agencies to factor in, for example, the COVID-19 peculiarities faced by countries to prevent unnecessary downgrades. So the African Development Bank published its African Economic Outlook for 2021, focusing on the debt crisis, and offers some of the solutions to these issues around looking more closely at contract designs to enhance countries' ability to engage with creditors and avoid litigations, also exploring financial innovations, which a number of other countries around the world have been doing. And of course, again, enhancing global coordination around this restructuring process. You also mentioned, our position on the IMF special drawing rights. So this recent issuance is really a significant and welcome action. But again, as was also mentioned by Professor Gilpin, 3.2% of that allocation. And this is really based on the proportion of their shares. But the African Development Bank remain fully engaged in discussions around finding some innovative ways to reallocate some of these SDRs to benefit those most in need. So basically, these initiatives, they're important and welcome, but far from enough to address the growing debt vulnerabilities on the continent. I think it's also important to remember that the debt situation was already of debt distress. So we cannot just blame the situation on the economic crisis caused by the pandemic. There are some underlying structural issues that governments must deal with. Some of these vulnerabilities have been caused partly by poor debt governance frameworks, suboptimal public investment decisions, poor debt management capacity, and of course, lack of transparency in debt management. So for Africa to grow out of debt and avoid the need for future debt restructurings, in the African Development Bank, we really firmly believe that the link between debt, governance, and growth must be strengthened. Governance reforms that eradicate any leakages in public finance, improve transparency in debt management, and boost efficiency of public investments must be reinforced. And our approach is really to systematically pursue governance reforms through our support and growth-friendly policies. So let me now just bring us a little bit back to the opening speech by our VP, which unfortunately was cut short. And there were 2 points that we missed and that are linked to this, which I just want to bring back into the discussion. And this is that in these discussions around elusivity and public participation has often been an afterthought in public financial management, and it must be prioritized. Citizens and civic groups alike should be engaged in the terms of new debts being issued and old debts being renegotiated by their governments. And young Africans in particular should be consulted. And there are opportunities through the digital tools available to do this: Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp. This promotes greater transparency and accountability and openness. And in the long run, it will foster a social cohesion and trust in public governance. And I think it's important because it links also back to the opening statement by Professor Attia. So I think I will stop here. I think I only had 3 minutes allocation, but I look forward to the ensuing discussions and participating again later on. Thank you.
Carina, I heard you talk a lot about the high cost of debt, the issues that have to do with governance as well, the initiatives that have been put in place to address Africa's debt crisis. And we've seen over the last couple of months, a lot of discussions around debt restructuring, possible debt reliefs, among other things. Do you think that this is an opportune time or moment for Africa to be considering an alternative debt architecture that makes credit more accessible and also less risky?
Absolutely. I mean, the message is basically that this is an opportunity for not be tapping into their SDR allocations or suspending debt repayments without doing anything about the underlying issues. And there are opportunities to diversify into lower risk types of debt, and explore more innovative financing mechanisms. And also at the level of MDBs, we also have an opportunity to also diversify our instruments in that regard, which is also something we are looking at, of increasing the availability of low risk and alternative finance is, of course, developing domestic capital markets. This is an area that we have that we accentuate in our debt action plan, something that needs to be invested in and looked into and supported in the future, so that African governments are able to tap in, which are greatly needed. Also tied into this, of course, is then also looking at some of these. We're already seeing some innovations in types of loans, such as the resource-backed loans, but there are a few issues tied to this, and a serious need for greater improved governance and transparency on how these are contracted. We're not saying that they are necessarily bad, but they need to be, contracts need to be crafted in a much more careful way, and more attention given to the transparency.
To read and sign the Harare Declaration, go to www.afrodat.org/initiatives. Click on Afrodat Conference on Debt and Development, and then read more. And finally, the outcome statement.